I never thought my life would change so dramatically on a Tuesday evening. It was just another day in our modest suburban home in Springfield, Missouri. The air was thick with the lingering scent of the pot roast I'd made for dinner, a futile attempt to bring some warmth to our increasingly cold relationship. I sat at our worn kitchen table, the surface marked with years of family meals and conversations, now reduced to a makeshift office as I sorted through our monthly bills. The soft glow of the table lamp cast shadows across the stack of envelopes before me, each one a reminder of the life Mark and I had built together. Or so I thought. I glanced over my shoulder at my husband, sprawled on our faded blue couch, his face illuminated by the harsh light of his smartphone. He'd been distant for months, but I kept telling myself it was just a phase, that all marriages had their ups and downs. Little did I know, I was about to experience the lowest down of my life. As I methodically opened each envelope, the routine of it all almost comforting, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of resentment. Here I was, making sure our life stayed afloat, while Mark seemed content to drift along, oblivious to the weight I carried. I sighed, the sound barely audible over the drone of the TV news in the background, reporting on some local scandal that seemed a world away from our quiet life. That's when it happened. A knock on the door, so forceful it seemed to shake the very foundation of our home. I jumped, my heart racing as I looked at Mark. For once, he met my gaze, but there was something in his eyes I couldn't quite place. Anticipation? Guilt? Before I could decipher it, another knock echoed through the house. "I'll get it," I said, pushing back from the table. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I made my way to the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I opened it, the sight before me made my stomach drop. There, on our porch, stood Mark's parents, Richard and Eleanor Thompson. Their presence alone wasn't unusual, they lived just across town, but the looks on their faces sent a chill down my spine. Eleanor, impeccably dressed as always in her designer pantsuit, clutched a manila envelope in her manicured hands. Her lips were curved into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Richard stood slightly behind her, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by an unsettling smugness. "Leah, dear," Eleanor's voice dripped with false sweetness, "I'm afraid you've overstayed your welcome." I blinked, confusion washing over me. I don't understand. This is my home." "Not anymore," Richard chimed in, his tone matter-of-fact. "We have some paperwork here that says otherwise." My mind reeled as I tried to make sense of their words. I turned back towards the living room, seeking Mark's face for some explanation, some reassurance that this was all a misunderstanding. What I saw instead was my husband, now standing, a grin playing at the corners of his mouth. It was an expression I'd never seen before, cold, calculating, almost predatory. "It's done, Leah," Mark announced, his voice eerily calm. He sauntered towards us, each step deliberate, as if he was savoring this moment. "I sold the house to my parents. Tonight's your last night here. Pack your things and leave." The words hit me like a physical blow. Our house, the very home we'd scrimped and saved for, the place where we'd talked about raising a family, had been sold without my knowledge or consent. And the mortgage? That was my responsibility. I'd been the one diligently paying it month after month, often dipping into my personal savings to make sure we never missed a payment. This can't be legal," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm on the mortgage. I've been making the payments." "You can't just owe." "But we can," Eleanor interrupted, waving the envelope. "It's all here, signed and notarized. The house belongs to us now." I felt my world tilting on its axis. This wasn't just betrayal. This was orchestrated cruelty, a carefully planned attack on everything I held dear. I looked at Mark, searching his face for any sign of the man I'd married, the person I'd promised to love and cherish. Instead, I saw a stranger, someone capable of unimaginable deceit. "Why?" The question escaped my lips before I could stop it. "Why would you do this?" Mark laughed, the sound grating against my ears. "Why? Because I can. Because I'm tired of this life, of you. It's time for a change, and this is how I'm making it happen." I felt tears welling up in my eyes, a mixture of shock, anger, and heartbreak threatening to overwhelm me. Mark must have noticed because his grin widened. "What? You're gonna cry about it?" It's already done. Get out. His words, so callous and dismissive, sparked something inside me. The initial shock began to give way to a slow-burning anger. I straightened my back, meeting Mark's gaze head-on. Are you sure you want to do this, Mark? My voice was quiet, but there was a steel beneath it that surprised even me. It wasn't a plea, it was a warning. But Mark, ever the arrogant fool, merely shrugged. Yes, I'm sure. Now, get packing. We don't have all night. I didn't waste another breath arguing. I could see there would be no reasoning with him, with any of them. Mark had made his choice, and his parents were all too happy to be complicit in this scheme. Without a word, I turned and walked back into the house, my mind already racing with what I needed to do next. As I moved through the rooms that had been my home for the past 5 years, gathering essentials and stuffing them into a suitcase, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Every object I touched, every photo I passed, held a memory, now tainted by this betrayal. The wedding picture on the mantel, the throw blanket we'd bought on our honeymoon, the mismatched plates in the kitchen cabinet, all of it a testament to a life I thought we were building together. I could hear Mark and his parents in the living room, their voices low but triumphant. They were probably already planning how to redecorate, how to erase any trace of my existence from this place. The thought made me sick to my stomach, but it also fueled my determination. I refused to let myself cry, not here, not in front of them. Pride was all I had left now, and I clung to it fiercely. As I zipped up my suitcase, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This house had been my sanctuary, the one place I thought was untouchable. But now I realized that true security, true strength, came from within. Mark might have taken my home, but he couldn't take my resilience, my dignity. I walked back into the living room, my head held high. Mark and his parents fell silent as I entered, their eyes following me as I moved towards the door. I could feel the weight of their stares, a mixture of smugness and perhaps a touch of unease at my composure. I hope you're satisfied, I said, my voice steady. But remember, Mark, what goes around comes around. You might think you've won, but this isn't over. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out of the house. The cool night air hit me as I stepped onto the porch, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. For a moment, I stood there, looking out at the quiet street, the familiar houses of our neighbors who had no idea of the drama unfolding behind our closed doors. As I made my way down the driveway, I couldn't help but turn back one last time. The house stood there, warm light spilling from the windows, looking for all the world like the happy home it had once been. A lifetime of memories, all gone in a single transaction. But as I looked up at those glowing windows, I felt a spark of determination ignite within me. Let's see what you'll do when it's your turn to lose everything, I whispered under my breath. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. Mark had wronged the wrong woman, and I knew exactly what I needed to do next. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where I would fight back and reclaim what was rightfully mine. With one last look at the house that was no longer my home, I turned and walked into the night, my mind already formulating a plan. Mark thought he had won, but he had no idea what was coming. The game had only just begun, and I intended to play it to win. The night air bit into my skin as I stood on the sidewalk, my suitcase a heavy weight by my side. The reality of what had just happened crashed over me in waves, each one threatening to pull me under. But I refused to drown. Not here, not now. Not when Mark and his parents could still see me from the window of what used to be our home. I took a deep breath, letting the familiar scents of Mrs. Johnson's rosebushes next door and the distant aroma of Gus's pizza down the street ground me. This was still my neighborhood, even if I no longer had a place in it. I had to think, to plan my next move. My first instinct was to call my best friend, Sarah. She lived just a few blocks away, and I knew she'd take me in without hesitation. But as I reached for my phone, I hesitated. The humiliation of having to explain what had happened, of admitting how thoroughly I'd been deceived, was too much to bear right now. Instead, I opened the Uber app and requested a ride to the nearest hotel. As I waited, I couldn't help but look back at the house. The curtains twitched, and I caught a glimpse of Eleanor's face, her expression a mixture of triumph and curiosity. She was probably wondering why I wasn't breaking down, why I wasn't causing a scene. Little did she know, the storm brewing inside me was just gathering strength. The Uber arrived, a beat-up Honda Civic with a friendly-looking driver named Tom. As we pulled away from the curb, I allowed myself one last look at the house. "Rough night?" Tom asked, his eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. I managed a weak smile. "You could say that." "Well, whatever it is, this too shall pass," he said kindly. "That's what my grandma always used to say." His words, though well-intentioned, felt hollow. How could this pass? How could I ever recover from such a betrayal? But I nodded politely, turning my attention to the familiar streets of Springfield as we drove. The neon signs of late-night diners and bars blurred together, a stark contrast to the turmoil in my mind. We pulled up to the Rockwood Inn, a modest hotel on the outskirts of town. I thanked Tom and tipped him generously. It might be the last act of normal kindness I'd be able to afford for a while. The lobby was deserted except for a sleeper-looking receptionist who barely looked up as I checked in. The room was small and impersonal, with generic floral prints on the walls and a faint smell of cleaning products. But it was clean, and more importantly, it was mine. No one could take it from me, at least not for tonight. I set my suitcase down and sank onto the bed, the events of the evening replaying in my mind like a bad movie. How had I been so blind? The signs had been there, Mark's increasing distance, the hushed phone calls, the sudden interest in his parents' opinions on our finances. But I had ignored them all, choosing to believe in the strength of our marriage, in the vows we had made. Anger bubbled up inside me, hot and fierce. I wanted to scream, to throw things, to go back to the house and demand justice. But I knew that wouldn't solve anything. No, I needed to be smarter than that. I needed to fight back in a way they wouldn't expect. I reached for my phone again, this time with purpose. I opened my banking app, my heart sinking as I saw our joint account had been drained. Of course, Mark had thought of that too. But he hadn't been as thorough as he thought. There was still my personal savings account, the one I had kept separate just in case. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to keep me afloat for a little while. Next, I opened my contacts and scrolled until I found the name I was looking for, Catherine Brennan. She was a lawyer I had met at a community fundraiser last year. We had chatted about her work in family law, and she had given me her card, just in case, she had said with a wink. At the time, I had laughed it off. Now, I was grateful for that chance encounter. I hesitated for a moment before pressing the call button. It was late, well past business hours. But this was an emergency, and I needed to act fast before Mark could cover his tracks any further. To my relief, Catherine answered on the third ring. Catherine Brennan speaking, her voice was crisp and professional, despite the late hour. "Catherine, it's Leah Thompson. We met at the Springfield Children's Hospital fundraiser last year. I need your help." My voice cracked on the last word, the emotion I had been holding back finally breaking through. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Catherine's voice softened. "Leah, of course. What's happened?" I took a deep breath and began to explain the situation. As I spoke, the reality of what had happened hit me anew. My voice trembled, but I forced myself to continue, to lay out every detail I could remember. Catherine listened quietly, only interrupting to ask for clarification on certain points. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then Catherine spoke, her voice filled with a quiet fury that matched my own. "Leah, what your husband and his parents have done is not just morally reprehensible, it's illegal. Selling a house without the consent of both parties, forging signatures, these are serious offenses. We're going to fight this, and we're going to win." Her confidence was reassuring, a lifeline I desperately needed. "What do we do first?" I asked, sitting up straighter, ready to take action. "First, you rest," Catherine said firmly. "You've been through a trauma, and you need to take care of yourself. Tomorrow morning, first thing, come to my office. Bring any documentation you have, bank statements, mortgage papers, anything related to the house. We'll start building our case." After getting Catherine's office address and setting a time to meet, I hung up. For the first time since Mark's betrayal, I felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't over. I wasn't going to let them win. I got up and went to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face. As I looked at my reflection in the mirror, I hardly recognized myself. My eyes were red-rimmed, my face pale with shock. But there was something else there too, a determination I hadn't seen in a long time. "You're stronger than this," I told my reflection. "You're going to get through this, and you're going to come out on top." I went back to the bed and opened my laptop. If I was going to fight, I needed to be prepared. I spent the next few hours researching property laws in Missouri, making notes on anything that seemed relevant. I also started a detailed timeline of events leading up to tonight, trying to pinpoint when Mark's behavior had started to change. As I worked, I felt my shock and sadness gradually giving way to a cold, focused anger. Mark hadn't just betrayed our marriage, he had violated my trust, stolen my home, and tried to leave me with nothing. Well, he was about to learn that I was far from nothing. The sky was starting to lighten when I finally closed my laptop. I was exhausted, but my mind was still racing. I lay down, not really expecting to sleep, but knowing I needed to try. Tomorrow was going to be a long day. As I drifted off, my last thoughts were of the house. Not of the betrayal, but of the life I had built there. The garden I had tended, the walls I had painted, the dreams I had nurtured. Mark might have taken the physical structure, but he couldn't take my memories, my strength, or my determination to reclaim what was rightfully mine. In the quiet of the early morning, as the first birds began to sing outside my window, I made a promise to myself. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where I would fight back, reclaim my dignity, and show Mark, his parents, and the world what I was truly made of. I woke up a few hours later to the harsh beeping of the hotel alarm clock. For a moment, I was disoriented, expecting to see the familiar surroundings of my bedroom. The events of the previous night came crashing back, and I felt a fresh wave of anger and determination wash over me. I got up, showered, and dressed in the most professional outfit I had managed to pack. As I applied my makeup, I studied my reflection. The woman looking back at me was tired, yes, but there was a fire in her eyes that couldn't be extinguished. I was ready for battle. With my head held high, I checked out of the hotel and caught a cab to Catherine's office. As we drove through the awakening streets of Springfield, I felt a strange mix of emotions. This was my city, my home. Every street corner held a memory, every building a piece of my life here. Mark might have taken our house, but he couldn't take this from me. Springfield was mine, and I wasn't going anywhere. Catherine's office was in a sleek building downtown, a far cry from the homey suburbs I was used to. As I rode the elevator to her floor, I steeled myself for what was to come. This was just the first step in a long journey, but I was ready. Mark had no idea what he had unleashed. He thought he had left me with nothing, but he was wrong. I had my strength, my dignity, and now I had the law on my side. The battle was just beginning, and I intended to win. The moment I stepped into Catherine's office, I felt a shift in the air. Gone was the uncertainty and fear that had plagued me since last night. In its place was a steely determination, fueled by the professional atmosphere of the law firm and Catherine's confident demeanor. "Leah," Catherine greeted me, her handshake firm and reassuring. "I'm glad you're here. Let's get started." For the next few hours, we pored over every document I had brought: bank statements, mortgage records, even old text messages where Mark had once reassured me that the house was as much mine as his. As we worked, I realized just how meticulously Mark had planned this betrayal. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision, it was a calculated move that had probably been in the works for months. "Leah," Catherine said, her voice cutting through my thoughts. "I want you to understand something. What Mark has done isn't just morally reprehensible, it's illegal. Selling a jointly owned property without the consent of both parties is fraud. And if we can prove that he forged your signature on any documents, that's another serious offense." I nodded, trying to process this information. Part of me was relieved to hear that the law was on my side, but another part was struggling to reconcile this new reality with the man I thought I had married. "So what do we do now?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Catherine leaned back in her chair, a determined glint in her eye. "Now, we start building our case. We'll file a formal complaint and launch a legal investigation. We'll also contact the bank to freeze any further actions tied to the property. Mark may think he's won, but he's about to learn that he's made a grave mistake. As Catherine outlined our strategy, I felt a flicker of hope ignite in my chest. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had a fighting chance. Over the next few days, I threw myself into the task of uncovering the truth. With Catherine's guidance, I dug deeper into our financial records, unearthing discrepancies I had overlooked before. It was like putting together a puzzle, each new piece revealing a clearer picture of Mark's deception. One afternoon, as I was going through old emails, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. It was a series of exchanges between Mark and his parents, dating back several months. They weren't just complicit in his scheme, they had been active participants, offering advice on how to hide assets and suggesting ways to manipulate me. I called Catherine immediately. "I found something," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "It's worse than we thought." Catherine arrived at my temporary apartment within the hour. As she read through the emails, her expression grew increasingly grave. "This is significant," she said finally, looking up at me. "Leah, this proves conspiracy. It's not just Mark, his parents are equally culpable." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I had never been close to Mark's parents, but I had always believed they respected me, if nothing else. To see evidence of their involvement in this betrayal was almost as painful as Mark's actions. "What does this mean for our case?" I asked, trying to focus on the practical implications rather than the emotional fallout. Catherine's smile was grim but satisfied. "It means we have them. This is exactly the kind of evidence we needed to strengthen our position. We'll use this to push for a full investigation into all of their financial dealings." As we continued to uncover the extent of Mark's deceit, I found myself grappling with a whirlwind of emotions. There was anger, of course, a deep, simmering rage that threatened to consume me if I let it. But there was also a profound sadness. Each new discovery was like losing Mark all over again, erasing another piece of the man I thought I had known. One particularly difficult moment came when I discovered that Mark had been siphoning money from our joint savings account for months. He had been preparing for this, ensuring he would have a cushion while leaving me with nothing. The betrayal cut deep, but it also fueled my determination to see this through. "He thinks he's so clever," I told Catherine during one of our meetings. "But he underestimated me." "He always did." Catherine nodded, a hint of admiration in her eyes. "That's his biggest mistake. He may have planned this for months, but he didn't count on you fighting back. And that's going to be his downfall." As we built our case, I found myself drawing strength from unexpected sources. Sarah, my best friend, had been a constant source of support since I finally told her what had happened. She offered me a place to stay, a shoulder to cry on, and a reminder of the person I was before all of this. "You're still you, Leah," she told me one evening as we sat on her porch, watching the sun set over Springfield. "Mark may have taken the house, but he can't take your spirit. That's all yours." Her words stayed with me, becoming a mantra of sorts as I navigated this new reality. I was still me, stronger, perhaps, and certainly wiser, but still the Leah who had built a life in this city, who had dreams and ambitions beyond being Mark's wife. As our investigation deepened, we uncovered more than just Mark's betrayal. We found evidence of financial mismanagement at his company, questionable dealings with clients, and a pattern of behavior that suggested this wasn't the first time he had tried to manipulate those around him. "We need to be careful," Catherine warned me. "The deeper we dig, the more dangerous this could become. Mark has a lot to lose, and he might not go down without a fight." Her words were prophetic. A few days later, I received a call from an unknown number. When I answered, I was met with Mark's voice, a mixture of anger and panic that I had never heard before. "What do you think you're doing, Leah?" he hissed. "Do you have any idea what you're getting into?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself against the rush of emotions his voice triggered. "I'm fighting for what's rightfully mine, Mark. Something you should have thought about before you decided to betray me." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. When Mark spoke again, his voice was low and threatening. "You need to back off. You have no idea what I'm capable of. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I refused to let him intimidate me. No, Mark. You have no idea what I'm capable of. This is just the beginning. I hung up before he could respond, my heart pounding. I immediately called Catherine to report the conversation. She was concerned but not surprised. This is good, she said, her voice calm and reassuring. It means we're getting to him. But Leah, I want you to be extra careful. Don't go anywhere alone, and if he tries to contact you again, don't engage. Let me handle it. As the days turned into weeks, our case against Mark and his parents grew stronger. We filed official complaints, initiated a formal investigation, and began the process of challenging the fraudulent sale of the house. It was a slow process, often frustrating, but I refused to give up. Through it all, I found myself changing. The woman who had stood shocked and heartbroken in the doorway of her home that fateful night was gone. In her place was someone stronger, more resilient, and absolutely determined to see justice done. One morning, as I was getting ready for another meeting with Catherine, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. The face looking back at me was familiar, yet different. There was a strength in my eyes that hadn't been there before, a set to my jaw that spoke of determination rather than defeat. I thought back to the night Mark had thrown me out, how he had laughed when he thought I might cry. Let's see who's laughing when this is over, I told my reflection. As I left Sarah's house, heading to Catherine's office, I felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from my life for far too long. Mark had tried to break me, to leave me with nothing. But he had failed. Instead, he had awakened a part of me that I didn't know existed, a fighter, a survivor. The road ahead was still long and uncertain. I knew there would be more challenges, more moments of doubt and fear. But I was ready for them. Mark had played his hand, thinking it was the end of the game. But he was wrong. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning, and I intended to see it through to the very last move. It was exactly a week after my world had been turned upside down that I woke to the insistent buzzing of my phone. The sky outside Sarah's guest room window was just beginning to lighten, the first tentative rays of sunlight peeking through the curtains. For a moment, I considered ignoring the call. After all, nothing good ever came from phone calls at this hour. But there was something about that persistent ringing that urged me to answer. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was the part of me that had become hypervigilant since Mark's betrayal. Whatever it was, I found myself reaching for the phone, my heart racing as I saw an unfamiliar number on the screen. "Hello," I answered, my voice still thick with sleep. "Leah." The sound of Mark's voice, crackling through the speaker, jolted me fully awake. Gone was the smug confidence I'd heard that night in his living room. Instead, his tone was laced with an unfamiliar edge of panic. "Mark," I replied, fighting to keep my voice steady. "What do you want?" I heard him take a deep breath, as though steeling himself. "We need to talk," he said. "Please." The plea in his voice almost made me laugh. Here was the man who had humiliated me, lied to me, and stolen from me, now begging for a conversation as though we were old friends catching up. "What could you possibly want to talk about, Mark?" I asked, my tone cool and controlled. There was a pause on the other end of the line, filled only by the sound of Mark's ragged breathing. When he spoke again, the panic in his voice was even more pronounced. "The house, it's a mess. My parents are saying they didn't know about the complications. The bank is calling about mortgage fraud, and there's an investigator asking questions about me. Did you report me?" I let his words hang in the air, savoring the moment. Part of me wanted to gloat, to revel in his obvious distress. But I knew better than to show my hand. "I did what I had to do, Mark," I replied, my words sharp enough to wound. "You threw me out, remember? You laughed in my face. Thought that was the end of it." I could almost see him pacing back and forth, that panic spilling into his every movement. "Leah, please," he begged. "You've got to help me fix this. You're the only one who understands." I hung up before he could finish. There was a certain satisfaction in cutting off someone who had taken so much from me. For a moment, I sat there in the quiet of the early morning, letting the reality of the situation sink in. Mark was scared. He was feeling the heat of his actions, and he was reaching out to me, the very person he had betrayed, for help. As I got up and started getting ready for the day, my mind was racing. Mark's call was more than just a plea for help, it was a warning sign. He was starting to realize the gravity of his actions, and that meant he might become desperate. I needed to tell Catherine about this development as soon as possible. I arrived at Catherine's office earlier than usual, the memory of Mark's panicked voice driving me forward. Catherine listened intently as I recounted the conversation, her expression growing more serious with each word. "This is significant, Leah," she said when I finished. "It tells us two important things. First, the pressure we're putting on Mark and his parents is working. They're starting to crack. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it seems there's some discord between Mark and his parents. We might be able to use that to our advantage." I nodded, trying to process this information. "What's our next move?" I asked. Catherine leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression on her face. "We keep pushing," she said. "We've got them on the defensive now. It's time to increase the pressure." Over the next few days, we did just that. Catherine filed additional motions, pushing for a faster resolution to our case. We also reached out to the bank, providing them with the evidence we had gathered of Mark's fraudulent activities. The response was almost immediate. I was in the middle of a meeting with Catherine when my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Turn on the news," it read. "Channel 5. Now." We switched on the small TV in Catherine's office, and I felt my jaw drop. There, on the screen, was a reporter standing outside Mark's company building. The ticker at the bottom of the screen read, "Local business under investigation for fraud." "Breaking news," the reporter was saying. "Springfield-based Thompson Enterprises is under investigation for alleged financial fraud. Sources close to the investigation say the company's CEO, Mark Thompson, is at the center of the allegations. The investigation reportedly stems from questionable real estate transactions and possible misuse of company funds." I turned to Catherine, my eyes wide. "Did you know about this?" She shook her head, looking as surprised as I felt. "No, but it doesn't surprise me. Once the bank started digging, it was only a matter of time before they uncovered the extent of Mark's activities." As we watched, the camera panned to show several official-looking cars pulling up to the building. Men and women in suits emerged, carrying briefcases and boxes. "It appears federal agents are now entering the Thompson Enterprises building," the reporter continued. "We'll bring you updates as this story develops." I felt a strange mix of emotions wash over me. There was satisfaction, of course, a sense of justice being served. But there was also a twinge of sadness. Despite everything, a small part of me still remembered the Mark I had fallen in love with, the man I thought I had married. Seeing his life and reputation crumble like this was harder than I had expected. "Leah," Catherine's voice broke through my thoughts. "Are you okay?" I took a deep breath, centering myself. "Yes," I said, surprised to find that I meant it. "Yes, I am. It's just a lot to process." Catherine nodded understandingly. "It's okay to have mixed feelings about this," she said. "What Mark did to you was terrible, but it's natural to still care about someone you shared a life with. Just remember, you didn't cause this. Mark made his own choices, and now he's facing the consequences." Her words helped ground me, reminding me of how far I'd come. I wasn't the same woman who had been blindsided by Mark's betrayal. I was stronger now, more resilient. I had fought back, and I was winning. As the days passed, more details of Mark's fraudulent activities came to light. It turned out that selling our house wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a larger pattern of financial mismanagement and fraud. Mark had been embezzling from his company for years, using the money to fund a lavish lifestyle and gambling habit that I had known nothing about. The revelation of Mark's gambling addiction hit me hard. How had I missed such a significant part of his life? But as I talked it through with Sarah and my therapist, a new addition to my support system that Catherine had insisted on, I realized that Mark had gone to great lengths to hide this part of himself from everyone, not just me. One evening, about a week after the investigation became public, I received another call from Mark. This time, I was prepared. "Leah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. I closed my eyes, letting his apology wash over me. For a moment, I allowed myself to remember the good times we had shared, the dreams we had built together. But then I remembered the look on his face the night he threw me out, the cruel laughter as he watched my world crumble. I appreciate your apology, Mark, I said, my voice calm and steady. But it doesn't change what you did. I hope you understand that. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Mark spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. I do, he said. I don't know what to do now. Everything's falling apart. For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity for him. But I quickly squashed it. Mark had made his choices, and now he had to live with the consequences. I can't help you, Mark, I said firmly. You need to talk to your lawyer. Goodbye. As I hung up, I felt a sense of closure wash over me. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt truly free of Mark and the pain he had caused me. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. The next morning, as I got ready for another day of meetings and legal proceedings, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was different from the one who had stood in shock in her living room weeks ago. She was stronger, more confident, with a determination in her eyes that spoke of battles fought and won. I smiled at my reflection, feeling a surge of pride. Mark had tried to break me, but he had only made me stronger. And as I headed out to face another day, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, I was ready to face them head on. The warning signs that Mark had missed, my strength, my resilience, my unwillingness to be a victim, were now clear for all to see. And I was just getting started. The day of the initial hearing arrived with a mix of anticipation and dread settling in my stomach. As I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my navy blue blazer, a power suit Sarah had insisted I buy for the occasion, I hardly recognized myself. Gone was the uncertain, broken woman from that fateful night. In her place stood someone stronger, more determined, with a fire in her eyes that couldn't be extinguished. You've got this, Leah, I told my reflection, taking a deep breath to steady my nerves. Catherine met me outside the Springfield County Courthouse, her presence a calming influence amidst the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. Remember, she said as we climbed the stone steps, we're not just here to win back your house. We're here to expose the truth and hold Mark accountable for his actions. I nodded, squaring my shoulders as we entered the imposing building. The courthouse was a hive of activity, with lawyers and clients hurrying in every direction. As we made our way to the designated courtroom, I couldn't help but feel a sense of surreal detachment. How had my life come to this? The courtroom itself was smaller than I'd imagined, with dark wood paneling and rows of uncomfortable-looking benches. As Catherine and I took our seats, I scanned the room, my heart skipping a beat when I saw Mark and his parents enter. Mark looked different. Gone was the cocky, self-assured man who had laughed in my face as he threw me out of our home. In his place was someone gaunt and haunted, with dark circles under his eyes and a nervous twitch in his left hand. His parents, too, seemed diminished somehow. Eleanor's usual impeccable appearance was marred by a slight dishevelment, while Richard's jovial demeanor had been replaced by a grim, tight-lipped expression. As they took their seats on the opposite side of the courtroom, Mark's eyes met mine for a brief moment. I saw a flicker of something, regret, fear, before he quickly looked away. It was a small victory, but it bolstered my resolve. They knew they were in trouble. The proceedings began with a flurry of legal jargon that made my head spin. Catherine had prepared me for this, explaining that the initial hearing was mostly about establishing the facts of the case and setting the groundwork for what was to come. Still, it was hard not to feel overwhelmed as the lawyers on both sides presented their arguments. Mark's lawyer, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit, tried to paint the whole thing as a simple misunderstanding. "Your Honor," he said, his voice smooth as oil, "this is merely a domestic dispute that has gotten out of hand. My client was acting in what he believed to be the best interests of his family." I felt a surge of anger at his words, but Catherine's hand on my arm kept me grounded. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't hold back. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and confident, "what we have here is not a misunderstanding, but a clear case of fraud and betrayal. Mr. Thompson not only sold a jointly owned property without his wife's consent, but he also forged her signature on multiple documents. This is not a domestic dispute, it's a criminal act. As Catherine laid out our case, presenting the evidence we had gathered over the past weeks, I watched Mark and his parents. Their faces grew increasingly pale as the extent of Mark's actions was revealed. When Catherine mentioned the evidence of embezzlement we had uncovered, I saw Eleanor reach out and grip Richard's hand, her knuckles white with tension. The judge, a stern-looking woman with graying hair and sharp eyes, listened intently to both sides before speaking. "This is clearly a complex case with serious allegations," she said, her voice carrying easily through the courtroom. "I'm ordering a freeze on all assets related to the property in question until this matter is resolved. Additionally, given the evidence presented of potential financial crimes, I'm recommending a full investigation into Mr. Thompson's business dealings." I felt a wave of relief wash over me at her words. It wasn't a full victory, not yet, but it was a start. As we left the courtroom, Catherine squeezed my shoulder. "This is good, Leah," she said. "We've got them on the defensive now." Over the next few weeks, the full extent of Mark's deception came to light. The investigation into his business dealings revealed a web of fraud and embezzlement that went far beyond our personal issues. It turned out that Mark had been using company funds to finance a lavish lifestyle and cover significant gambling debts. The house sale, it seemed, was just the tip of the iceberg. I watched from the sidelines as Mark's carefully constructed world began to crumble. His company's stock plummeted as news of the investigation broke, and longtime business partners distanced themselves from him. The local news was full of reports about the Thompson scandal, with reporters camped outside his house, hoping for a statement. Through it all, I found myself grappling with conflicting emotions. There was satisfaction, of course, in seeing justice being served. But there was also a deep sadness for the life we had once shared, for the dreams that had been shattered by Mark's actions. One evening, as Sarah and I were having dinner at our favorite local diner, the Rusty Spoon, I confessed these feelings to her. "Is it wrong that I sometimes feel sorry for him?" I asked, pushing my meatloaf around my plate. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Of course not, Leah," she said. "You loved him for a long time. It's natural to have complicated feelings about all this. But don't forget, he made his choices. You're not responsible for the consequences of his actions." Her words helped, as they always did. Sarah had been my rock through this whole ordeal, offering a spare room, a shoulder to cry on, and unwavering support. I don't know how I would have made it through without her. As the legal proceedings continued, Mark's desperation became increasingly apparent. He made several attempts to contact me, each one more frantic than the last. I maintained my distance, on Catherine's advice, but it was hard to ignore the pain in his voice when he left messages begging for a chance to explain. The final blow came when the FBI got involved. What had started as a local investigation into fraud quickly escalated into a federal case. I'll never forget the day I saw the news footage of Mark being led out of his office in handcuffs, his face ashen and defeated. That evening, as I sat in Sarah's living room watching the coverage, I felt a strange sense of closure. The man on the screen, looking small and scared in his rumpled suit, was not the Mark I had married. That Mark, the one I had loved and built a life with, had been gone for a long time, perhaps had never really existed at all. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, settling onto the couch beside me with 2 mugs of tea. I took a deep breath, considering the question. "I think I am," I said, surprised to find that I meant it. "It's over, isn't it?" "Really over?" Sarah nodded, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "It is. And you made it through, Leah. You're stronger than you ever knew." As the legal proceedings wound down, the outcomes began to solidify. The court ruled in my favor, granting me full ownership of the house and ordering Mark to pay significant damages for the emotional and financial strain he had caused. His parents, too, were implicated in the fraud, their complicity in the scheme impossible to deny in the face of the evidence we had gathered. The day I moved back into the house was bittersweet. As I walked through the rooms, memories of the life I had shared with Mark threatened to overwhelm me. But with each box I unpacked, each picture I hung on the walls, I reclaimed the space as my own. This was no longer our house, it was mine, bought and paid for with my strength and resilience. As I settled back into my life in Springfield, I found myself changed in ways I never expected. The betrayal I had suffered at Mark's hands had been painful, yes, but it had also awakened a strength in me that I never knew I possessed. I had faced my worst nightmare and come out the other side, not just surviving, but thriving. The collapse of Mark's carefully constructed facade had been swift and total. But from the ruins of our shared life, I had built something new, a life that was wholly my own, founded on strength, resilience, and the unwavering support of true friends. As I looked to the future, I felt not fear or uncertainty, but a sense of excitement. The road ahead was unknown, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready to face whatever it might bring. As the dust settled on the legal battle that had consumed my life for months, I found myself standing in the doorway of what was now, unequivocally, my home. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow on the hardwood floors. It was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that had defined my recent past. I took a deep breath, inhaling the familiar scent of lemon furniture polish and the faint aroma of the rosebushes outside. This house, once a symbol of my shared life with Mark, now represented something entirely different: my resilience, my strength, and the beginning of a new chapter. With slow, deliberate steps, I walked through each room. The living room, where we had spent countless evenings watching movies and planning our future. The kitchen, where I had prepared meals for dinner parties with friends who had since rallied around me in my darkest hours. The bedroom, once a sanctuary, now stripped of Mark's presence and ready to be reclaimed as my own space. As I moved through the house, I found myself talking out loud, a habit I'd developed during the long, lonely nights at Sarah's place. "Well, Leah," I said to myself, running my hand along the smooth surface of the dining room table, "what now?" It was a question that had been nagging at me ever since the final gavel fell in the courtroom. With the legal battle behind me and my immediate future secure, I was faced with the daunting task of rebuilding my life. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. I made my way to the back porch, settling into the old wicker chair that had been a fixture since we first moved in. The backyard stretched out before me, the grass a little overgrown, the flower beds in need of attention. It was a fitting metaphor for my life, a little wild and unkempt, but full of potential. As I sat there, watching the sun dip lower in the sky, I allowed myself to really feel everything I'd been through. The shock of Mark's betrayal, the fear and uncertainty of those first few days, the anger that had fueled me through the legal proceedings, and finally, the bittersweet triumph of reclaiming my life. Tears came then, not the desperate sobs of those early days, but a gentle release. I cried for the woman I had been, for the dreams that had been shattered, for the trust that had been broken. But I also cried in relief, in gratitude for the strength I had found within myself and for the unwavering support of friends like Sarah and professionals like Catherine. As the tears subsided, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. For the first time in months, I felt truly present in my own skin, anchored in the moment rather than caught up in the whirlwind of legal battles and emotional turmoil. The ringing of my phone broke the silence. It was Sarah, checking in as she had every day since this ordeal began. "Hey, how are you holding up?" Her voice was warm with concern. "I'm okay," I said, surprising myself with the realization that it was true. "I think I'm ready to start thinking about what's next." Sarah's excitement was palpable even through the phone. "That's great, Leah. Have you given any thought to what you want to do?" I laughed softly. "About a million thoughts, but nothing concrete yet. I think I need to take some time to really figure out what I want." "Well, whenever you're ready, I'm here to help brainstorm. Or just to listen," Sarah said. "Hey, why don't you come over for dinner tomorrow? We can celebrate your new beginning." I agreed, grateful once again for her friendship. As I hung up, I felt a spark of excitement ignite within me. A new beginning. The phrase echoed in my mind, full of promise. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. I threw myself into reclaiming and refreshing my space. I repainted the bedroom, choosing a soothing sage green that made me feel calm and centered. I rearranged the furniture in the living room, creating a cozy reading nook by the bay window. Each change, no matter how small, felt like an act of reclamation. I also started reconnecting with old friends and making new ones. I joined a local book club, something I'd always wanted to do but had never found the time for when I was caught up in the day-to-day of married life. I started taking yoga classes at the community center, finding that the physical activity helped quiet my still-racing mind. One sunny Saturday morning, as I was tending to the neglected flower beds in the backyard, my neighbor Mrs. Johnson called over the fence. "Leah, dear, it's so good to see you back," she said, her kind face creased with a warm smile. "We've all missed you around here." I straightened up, wiping my hands on my gardening gloves. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. It's good to be back." She hesitated for a moment, then said, "I hope you don't mind me saying, but you seem different. Stronger, somehow." Her words caught me off guard, but as I thought about it, I realized she was right. I was different. The Leah who had left this house in tears months ago was not the same Leah who had returned. I had been broken, yes, but I had put myself back together, stronger at the mended places. "I think you're right," I said, smiling at her. "I feel stronger." As the conversation with Mrs. Johnson ended, I found myself thinking about work. Before all of this happened, I had been content in my job as an elementary school teacher. But now, I felt a pull towards something different. The experience of fighting for myself, of navigating the complex legal system, had awakened a new interest in me. That evening, I called Catherine. "I've been thinking," I said after we exchanged pleasantries, "about going back to school. To study law." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Catherine's voice came through, filled with enthusiasm. "Leah, I think that's a fantastic idea. You've got the drive, the intelligence, and now, the first-hand experience. You'd make an excellent lawyer." Her words bolstered my confidence. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into researching law schools, studying for the LSAT, and preparing applications. It was challenging, especially after being out of school for so long, but I found that I thrived on the intellectual stimulation. As summer turned to fall, I received news that filled me with both excitement and trepidation. I had been accepted to law school at the University of Missouri. It would mean leaving Springfield, leaving the house I had fought so hard to reclaim. But as I stood in the living room, acceptance letter in hand, I realized that the house had served its purpose. It had been a battleground, a place of healing, and now, it could be a stepping stone to my future. I called Sarah immediately to share the news. "I'm so proud of you, Leah," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've come so far." That night, as I sat on the back porch watching the sunset, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The betrayal, the pain, the fight, all of it had led me here, to this moment of new beginnings. I thought about Mark, briefly wondering where he was, what he was doing. The last I had heard, he was serving time for his financial crimes. I was surprised to find that thinking of him no longer brought the sharp pain it once had. Instead, I felt a complex mix of emotions, sadness for what we had lost, anger at his betrayal, but also a strange sense of gratitude. His actions, as hurtful as they had been, had set me on this new path. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I made a decision. I would sell the house. Not because I needed to escape the memories, but because I was ready to create new ones. The house had been a symbol of my marriage, then of my fight, and now it could be the means to fund my new future. The process of selling the house and preparing for law school kept me busy over the next few months. Each box I packed felt like I was boxing up a piece of my old life, making room for the new. It was bittersweet, but more sweet than bitter. On my last night in the house, I walked through each room, saying goodbye. In the bedroom, I thanked the space for being my refuge. In the kitchen, I ran my hand along the counter where I had spent so many hours stress baking during the worst of the legal battle. In the living room, I stood by the window, remembering the day I had stood there watching Mark drive away, thinking my world had ended. Finally, I stepped out onto the back porch. The wicker chair creaked as I sat down, a familiar and comforting sound. I looked out at the backyard, at the flower beds I had brought back to life, at the trees that had witnessed so much of my story. "Thank you," I whispered to the house, to the yard, to the life I had lived here. "Thank you for sheltering me, for being the battleground where I found my strength, and for being the launching pad for my new beginning. As I sat there, I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. The journey had been difficult, often painful, but it had led me here, to this moment of quiet triumph, of hope, of new beginnings. The next morning, as I loaded the last of my boxes into my car, I took one final look at the house. The sold sign stood proudly in the front yard, a testament to another battle won. But more than that, it was a sign of moving forward. As I pulled out of the driveway for the last time, I didn't feel regret or sadness. Instead, I felt a surge of excitement for what lay ahead. Law school, a new career, a life of my own making, it was all waiting for me. I had entered this house as one half of a couple, left it broken-hearted and betrayed, fought to reclaim it, and now I was leaving it whole, strong, and ready for whatever came next. As I drove away, my rearview mirror filled with the image of the house growing smaller, I smiled to myself. "Here's to new beginnings," I said aloud, my voice strong and sure. And with that, I turned onto the main road, ready to write the next chapter of my story.